The courthouse security officer didn't hesitate. He grabbed the woman by the collar of her scrubs, shoved her hard against the marble wall, and slapped her across the face with an open hand right there in the main hallway of the Harlow County Courthouse, in front of two other officers, three civilians, and a security camera that nobody bothered to check. The crack of it echoed off the stone floors. The woman didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even step back. She simply turned her face forward again, looked the officer dead in the eyes, and said nothing. That silence was the most terrifying thing anyone in that hallway had ever witnessed. They just didn't know it yet. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started cold. A front had moved through Harlow overnight, dropping the temperature 15 degrees by sunrise, and leaving the streets slick with a thin layer of moisture that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite frost. Nurse Dara Whitfield drove her 10-year-old Civic through downtown Harlow with the heat cranked and a thermos of coffee wedged between her thigh and the center console. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the courthouse. Her shift at Harlow Regional Medical Center had ended at 6 a.m. after a 14-hour overnight run that had left her with dried blood on her left forearm. She hadn't noticed until she was halfway to the parking garage. She had been home for 40 minutes, barely enough time to change into clean scrubs and drink half a cup of coffee when her phone rang. Whitfield. The voice on the other end was clipped, institutional. This is Clerk Adler from Harlow County Court. We have a medical situation with a witness in protective custody. He's presenting with chest pain and shortness of breath. Our on-call service is 40 minutes out and the witness cannot be transported. I'm off shift. You're the closest credentialed emergency nurse in our system. Judge Calloway authorized the call. We need someone now. Dara looked at the coffee in her hand. She thought about the shower she hadn't taken. She thought about the 3 hours of sleep she was supposed to get before picking up her nephew from school. I'll be there in 12 minutes, she said. She drove with the bag in her passenger seat, the portable trauma kit she kept in her trunk out of habit, left over from years of behavior she had never entirely shed. Inside it were things a standard emergency nurse didn't typically carry. Dara had stopped explaining that to people a long time ago. She pulled into the courthouse parking structure at 7:58, locked the car, shouldered the bag, and walked toward the main entrance. The first thing she noticed was the officer posted at the exterior security station. He was broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a jaw like a concrete block, and the particular kind of posture that came not from military service, but from years of having authority over a small patch of territory. His name badge read SGK Dillard. He was watching her approach with the specific expression of a man who had already decided something before she opened her mouth. Courthouse is restricted access this morning, he said, stepping slightly to the side so his body angled across the path. Public entrance is closed, I know. Dara shifted the bag strap on her shoulder. I'm here on a medical call. Clerk Adler from the third-floor administrative office requested an emergency nurse for a witness in custody. My name is Dara Whitfield. I'm an RN at Harlow Regional. Dillard looked at her scrubs, then at the bag, then back at her face. You got credentials? I have my hospital ID and a nursing license card. She reached into her front pocket and held them out. Dillard looked at them, the way someone looks at a parking ticket. They're deciding whether to contest. This doesn't give you courthouse access, he said, handing them back. I understand that. That's why I'm asking you to call up to the clerk's office so they can verify. The call came from Clerk Adler. I don't call up to clerk offices because somebody shows up and tells me to. Dara kept her voice level. There is a man inside this building who is possibly having a cardiac event. The authorization came from Judge Calloway's bench. If you want to stand here and discuss it, that's your choice. But I'm asking you to make the call. Dillard's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way she'd said that. Not the words, the tone. Calm, measured. The tone of someone who is accustomed to being the most composed person in a room full of chaos, and had learned that composure itself could be a weapon. Step back from the entrance, he said. I'm not going to do that. It happened fast after that. The way these things always do, not building slowly but snapping, like a cable under tension. Dillard stepped forward, grabbed her by the upper arm, and the second officer, who had been hanging back younger, with a sharp face and the name Carver on his badge, moved to her other side. They turned her toward the wall. The marble was cold through her scrubs. Dillard's hand shoved her shoulder blades flat against the stone, and then his right hand came up and hit her across the left cheek with a force that was deliberate, not reflexive. Not a push that accidentally connected, a slap, intentional. Open palm, the sound carried. The three civilians near the security desk, a middle-aged man in a suit, an older woman with a canvas briefcase, a young paralegal in her 20s, all froze. One of them made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Dara felt the impact, felt the heat that followed it, felt the slight ring in her left ear that she recognized from training scenarios, from the one time overseas, when a concussion blast had briefly scrambled her hearing. She did not reach up to touch her face. She did not make a sound. She turned her head back toward Dillard and looked at him with the exact same expression she'd been wearing before he touched her. Dillard blinked. Something in that look unsettled him, though he couldn't have explained why. Carver already had the zip restraints out, secured her wrists in front of her body, took the medical bag, and walked her toward the internal security corridor that led to the lower-level holding facilities. You're being detained for trespassing, impersonating authorized court personnel, and resisting a lawful order, Dillard said, behind her now. Dara said nothing. What she was doing instead, as they walked her through the corridor, as her eyes moved over every intersection and door and camera mount they passed, was cataloging. Entry points, camera angles, personnel positions, the position of a third officer down the hall who had seen them coming and turned away, the body language of deliberate non-involvement, the faint smell of gas that didn't belong. That last one made her slow her pace by half a step. Dillard nudged her shoulder. Keep moving. She kept moving, but her mind was somewhere else now. The holding room in the lower level of the Harlow County Courthouse was a repurposed storage space that had been retrofitted somewhere in the previous decade, with a bench, a camera mount, and a door with a keypad lock. It was not designed for comfort. The fluorescent light buzzed at a frequency that would eventually become maddening. There was no window. They left her there with her wrists still restrained, sitting on the bench, her medical bag confiscated, her phone on Dillard's belt. Carver hesitated at the door. He was 26, maybe 27, with the slightly unfocused look of someone who had never quite thought through the distance between doing what he was told and doing what was right. We'll get someone from the clerk's office down here, he said, to clarify the situation. Call Clerk Adler, Dara said. Ask them to confirm the authorization. Sure, the door closed. The keypad beeped. Dara sat for a moment in the humming light and looked at the room. She counted the ceiling tiles, estimated the square footage, located the camera mount, angled toward the bench, standard position, functional. She noted the camera indicator light was green. Recording. She noted that Dillard, when he'd slapped her, had been facing the corridor camera, his body oriented toward it, the motion fully in frame. She had seen the camera before he grabbed her. She had made no move to avoid it. She had known the angle. She also knew that the emergency radio traffic from her arrival. Carver had been running his communications unit on an open channel, had been picked up on courthouse dispatch. Every word of the exchange at the entrance had been transmitted. She sat back against the cold wall and breathed slowly. The smell of gas was stronger down here. Dara Whitfield had grown up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the youngest of 4 children in a household that was not unkind, but was not generous with softness either. She had learned early that the way to survive a room that didn't want you in it was not to fight the room and not to shrink from it, but to simply remain quiet, observant, immovable until the room adjusted around you. She had taken that quality with her into nursing school, where she'd been one of 3 black women in her cohort, and had learned quickly which instructors graded the same and which ones didn't. She had taken it into Harlow Regional's emergency department, where she'd spent 6 years becoming one of the most reliable trauma nurses on the overnight shift. She'd built a reputation not for speed or loudness, but for the kind of precise, unhurried competence under pressure that other nurses noticed when they worked beside her, and that physicians, even the arrogant ones, eventually stopped arguing again. What almost nobody at Harlow Regional knew was where that quality had been forged. For 7 years before nursing, Dara had served in a specialized medical support unit embedded with a U.S. Special Operations Task Force. She had worked in environments where medical decisions were made under fire, where the difference between a correct call and a wrong one was measured in the time it took blood to reach a floor. She had been trained in tactical medicine, emergency airway management, hemorrhage control under stress, mass casualty triage protocols, and the particular discipline of functioning with complete cognitive clarity in situations that would paralyze most people. She had also been trained in things that did not appear on any nursing curriculum: surveillance awareness, threat assessment, personnel evaluation, how to read a room for danger before the danger announced itself. She had left that life after an operation in a country she was not permitted to name, under circumstances that remained classified, that had come closer to ending her than anything she was willing to examine. She had come home and applied to a nursing program and spent years building something quieter, something that was hers. She did not talk about it. She didn't hang anything on her walls. She didn't wear anything that indicated it. The people she worked with knew she was excellent at her job, and that she was difficult to rattle, and that she had a past she didn't discuss, and they respected that last part, mostly because she never made a point of it. The only people outside of her immediate family who knew the full shape of her military record were two former colleagues, a federal investigator who had reached out to her twice for consultation on cases involving tactical medical scenarios, and a woman named Judge Sylvia Okafor who had been a JAG officer during the years when Dara's unit operated, and who had, 3 months ago, contacted Dara with an unusual request. Harlow County had been experiencing a documented pattern of civil rights complaints from individuals who had passed through its courthouse. Complaints about security misconduct, intimidation, falsified incident reports. The complaints consistently targeted the same personnel, the same hallways, the same kind of people. The investigation that had been opened twice had been quietly shut down, both times before it reached any of the people whose names appeared most often. Judge Okafor needed someone credible, someone who wouldn't be noticed walking in, someone who would know exactly what to look for, and who wouldn't be rattled if something went wrong. Dara had agreed. She had done harder things. She had not agreed because she thought nothing would happen to her. She had agreed because she understood that the thing she was looking for had to be allowed to show itself. Documentation required proximity. Proximity sometimes required accepting cost. The camera was recording. The radio traffic had been captured. And whatever Sergeant Dillard thought he had neutralized by putting her in this room, he had in fact handed her exactly what she needed. Except for the gas, the smell wasn't ambiguous. Natural gas had a distinctly artificial odor, the mercaptan additive, that companies introduced precisely so people could identify it, and Dara had recognized it the moment they'd descended to the lower corridor. It had been faint then. It was not faint now. She stood and moved to the door, put the back of her hand near the bottom gap. The odor was coming from outside the room, concentrated in the corridor, which meant the source was somewhere in the lower level infrastructure. A line failure, a valve. She didn't know, and it didn't matter in the next 60 seconds what the cause was. She went to the camera and looked directly at it. "There is a gas leak in the lower corridor," she said clearly, in the tone she used when she needed someone to actually absorb what she was saying. "I can smell mercaptan through the door gap. You need to initiate building evacuation immediately and get someone to cut the main gas supply to the lower level. This is not a drill. I need to be released from this room." She stepped back, looked at the door. Nothing happened for 40 seconds. Then the building shook. Not a tremble. A concussive impact, the particular kind of pressure wave that came from an explosion in an enclosed structure, traveling through walls and floors rather than air. The fluorescent light above her flickered, went out, came back on dim, flickered again and died. The emergency lighting kicked in, red-tinted, battery-powered, sufficient to see shapes. From outside the door she heard a sharp crack, a sound like something structural giving way, and then distant but clearly human voices shouting. Then a second sound, an alarm that cut through everything else. Fire suppression, building emergency, the flat mechanical scream of a courthouse in crisis. Dara moved. The door was keypad locked, but the explosion had done something to the power cycling on the lower level, and keypad locks on holding rooms at this facility had an emergency release function triggered by building alarm systems, a safety code requirement she had noted when she researched the courthouse's layout. She heard the mechanism disengage, the flat click of magnetic lock releasing, and she pushed the door open. The corridor was thick with smoke. Not black smoke, lighter gray, the kind that preceded fire rather than accompanied it. The gas had gone somewhere, and something had ignited it, but the main structural fire was not here yet. There was time, not much. She moved left, following the corridor away from the direction the explosion had come from, covering her nose and mouth with her elbow. Emergency lighting cast everything in dim red. She found Deputy Harlan Morse on the floor 15 feet from the stairwell door. He was conscious but disoriented, a laceration above his right eye bleeding steadily, his left leg at an angle that told her the fibula had taken impact. He was trying to get himself upright and not managing it. "Don't," she said, crouching beside him. "Lie flat. Let me look at you." "Who are you?" "Dara Whitfield. I'm a nurse." "You're bleeding from above the right eye. It's not arterial. You need pressure." Your left leg is injured. You should not put weight on it. Is anyone else on this level? T coughed. 2 detainees in the East Block. Martinez and I, are they mobile? Martinez's. The other one had knee surgery last week. Okay. She pulled the necktie from Morse's collar. He was wearing a clip-on, courthouse standard, and pressed it against the laceration, guiding his hand to hold it. Keep pressure there. Do not move the leg. I'm going for the detainees. She went. The East Block was 2 corridors and a turn from where she'd found Morse. The smoke was thickening. She stayed low, moved fast, found the block door propped open the magnetic lock had released here too, and went inside. 2 men, one on his feet and already moving, one seated on a bench with the slack, slightly greenish expression of someone fighting nausea and pain, his left knee wrapped in a compression bandage over surgical dressing. Can you stand? She said to the seated man. I'm not asking if it hurts. I'm asking if you can stand. Something in her voice settled him. He grabbed the bench edge, pulled himself up. His face went white. He breathed through it. Good, she said. We're moving. Put your arm around your cellmate. Step through any pain you feel. It won't kill you. The smoke might. Move. She got them moving. She went back for Morse, got his arm over her shoulder, and started them all toward the stairwell. The stairwell was accessible. She moved the 3 men through it and up, emerging into the main floor corridor, where 3 courthouse employees were frozen in place near the security desk, not quite panicking but not moving either. The particular paralysis that hit civilians who had no training for this and were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Everyone moved toward the east exterior exit, Dara said, at a volume that cut through the alarm without competing with it. That's the hallway to your left away from the smell. Do not use the central atrium. Move now. They moved. Carver was in the hallway near the east security station, talking rapidly into his radio. He stopped when he saw Dara emerge from the stairwell with an injured deputy on one arm and 2 detainees behind her. For a moment, he just stared. I need a first aid kit, and I need someone to call off any attempt to re-enter the lower level until the gas supply is confirmed. Shut, she said. Where is your first aid station? East wall, Carver said automatically. Then you were in a holding room. I was, she said. First aid kit now. She got Morse to the east wall bench, got the kit open, got a proper pressure bandage on the laceration, while Carver stood there with his radio in his hand, doing the very slow cognitive work of recalibrating every assumption he'd woken up with. Where's Dillard? She said, without looking up from Morse's forehead. He went down to stopped. He went toward the basement. Dara's hands paused for half a second. Then she finished the bandage. Outside, through the corridor windows, she could see the parking lot beginning to fill fire department vehicles, an ambulance unit, 2 sheriff's cruisers, and then, pulling into the lot in a way that was not consistent with emergency response, but with something more organized, 2 black government vehicles that moved with the particular unhurried precision of federal transit. The vehicles stopped. People got out. They were not fire department. The lead figure moved toward the entrance with the ease of someone who had been in worse buildings on worse days and had never once considered that any of it might stop them. She was a tall woman in a dark coat with federal identification on her belt and the posture of someone who had made decisions under fire for so long that the capacity for hesitation had simply been trained away. She pushed through the east entrance door, swept the room with one practiced look, and her gaze landed on Dara. She stopped walking. She said, Captain Whitfield. Every person in the corridor heard it. Carver turned. The courthouse employees, who had followed Dara out of the smoke, turned. Deputy Morse, lying on the bench with a bandage on his head, tilted his face to look. The woman in the dark coat was Deputy Inspector General Maureen Takahaz, and the last time Dara had seen her face was in a classified after-action file on an operation that officially did not exist. The last time Takahaz had spoken her name, it had been in a context where the word captain had a specific meaning, a rank, a record. A set of decisions made in an impossible situation that had resulted in a commendation that was itself classified, buried under 3 layers of federal administrative code. Dara stood up from beside Morse's bench. She looked at Takahaz. She said nothing, but the room had already changed. Every person in that corridor felt it, the shift in weight, the recalibration of something they couldn't name. The woman they had watched lead injured people out of a smoke-filled basement without hesitation was not who Dillard had decided she was when he looked at her scrubs and made his determination. From deeper in the building came a sound, voices, movement, radio traffic, and then Sergeant Dillard appeared at the far end of the corridor, disheveled, a smear of dust across his forehead. emerging from the smoke with the faintly dazed expression of a man who had gone looking for control and found instead that the situation had organized itself entirely without him. He saw Dara standing at the east wall. He saw the federal vehicles outside. He saw Takaha's. And then he saw what Carver was looking at the camera at the east security station, which had been running on battery backup, its small indicator light a steady, indifferent green. Dillard's face did something complicated that he couldn't quite control. Dara picked up her medical bag, which someone had left near the first aid station when the evacuation began, and zipped it closed with the quiet, methodical motion of someone who had finished what they came to do. She had not raised her voice once. She had not explained herself to anyone who wasn't ready to hear it. She had simply remained, and the room, as it always did, had adjusted around her. Takaha's took 3 steps toward her. Stopped. "You want to tell me," Takaha said, "what exactly I just drove 2 hours to walk into?" Dara looked at her steadily, looked at Dillard, looked at the camera. "It's already on tape," Dara said quietly. "All of it." Takaha's didn't respond immediately. That was one of her qualities, the ability to absorb information without immediately performing a reaction to it. And it was the quality that had made her effective in oversight roles, where most people burned themselves out by the second year. She looked at the camera. She looked at Dillard. She looked at the green indicator light. Then she turned to the 2 agents who had come in behind her and said, simply, "Secure that footage." They moved. Dillard took a step forward, the instinct of a man whose authority had always been spatial. He controlled rooms as by positioning himself at their center, by moving toward problems before they could become situations. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are or what jurisdiction you're claiming, but this is a county courthouse, and whatever she told you—" "She hasn't told me anything," Takaha said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was watching one of her agents plug a secure drive into the camera station's recording console. "I haven't asked her a single question yet." "Then let me explain the situation. We had an unverified individual attempting unauthorized." "Your name," Takaha said, finally looking at him. "Sergeant Kenneth Dillard, Courthouse Security Sergeant Dillard." She said it the way you'd read a name off an intake form. Flat. Informational. "I'm going to ask you to step to the east wall and stay there. Don't talk to your colleague. Don't touch your radio. Don't go anywhere." She paused. "I'm not asking." Dillard's jaw worked. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, the rapid, flickering math of a man trying to figure out whether what was happening was something he could still manage. The answer he arrived at slowly was no. He stepped to the east wall. Carver had already figured that out. He'd been standing against the wall for the last 4 minutes. Takaz crossed to where Dara was and stopped at a distance that wasn't intimate but wasn't formal either. The distance of 2 people who had history and knew how to carry it without making it a performance. "The witness," Dara said. "3rd floor, protective custody." That was the original call. Takaz nodded once. "We'll get someone up there." She gestured to a 3rd agent who peeled off toward the stairwell. Then she looked at Dara more carefully at the mark on her left cheek, which was reddening now, settling into something that would be visible for days. Her expression didn't shift, but something behind it did. "Are you injured?" "Nothing that matters." "That's not what I asked." Dara held her gaze. "I'm functional." Takaz accepted that because she'd had to accept similar answers from Dara before, in situations where the alternative was a longer conversation than either of them had time for. She turned and surveyed the corridor, the evacuated employees, the injured deputy on the bench, the 2 detainees sitting on the floor near the fire exit because no one had told them where else to go, the haze of smoke still threading in from the stairwell door that someone had propped open. "What caused the explosion?" "Gas line failure in the lower level," Dara said. "I could smell it before they put me in the holding room. I don't know yet if it was structural deterioration or something else." She said that last part carefully, not as an accusation. As a variable she wasn't prepared to eliminate. Takaha's heard the careful part. Her eyes moved to Dillard. "We'll find out," she said. The fire department cleared the lower level within the hour. 3 firefighters in respiratory equipment traced the gas to a corroded junction in a utility pipe that ran along the east basement wall, a legitimate infrastructure failure, the kind that happened in buildings that hadn't been properly maintained, which the Harlow County Courthouse had not been, based on the maintenance logs that one of Takaha's agents pulled from the facility's management office before 11 a.m. The explosion had been accidental. That was the determination. What was not accidental was what the explosion revealed. The same utility corridor that contained the failed gas junction also contained a secondary archive room locked. Off the official building map, accessible through a fire door that had been painted over twice and was not listed in any courthouse directory that building staff could produce. The door was visible from the corridor once the smoke cleared. The fire team had noted it in their incident report as an unmapped space. Takaz's agents had been inside it within 20 minutes of the all clear. What they found were filing boxes, 17 of them stacked along 2 metal shelves, organized by year. Inside the boxes were paper documents not digital, not backed up anywhere, not indexed in the courthouse's official record system, and those documents contained something that nobody in an official capacity was supposed to know existed. Takaz called Dara into the corridor outside the room at 10:30. She showed her a single sheet from the top box held in a gloved hand, already photographed, already logged as evidence. The sheet was a complaint form, the kind that courthouse visitors could fill out if they experienced misconduct from security personnel. The form had been filled in by hand. The box at the top right for the receiving officer's initials read K. D. He received his own misconduct complaints, Dara said, and marked them processed. Takaz turned the sheet over. The back was stamped reviewed unfounded in red ink, initialed in the same hand. 17 boxes going back 6 years. We don't know the full count yet, but from what my team has scanned so far, the number of complaints that reached this room and went no further is, she paused, substantial. Dara looked at the form. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was looking at the name of the complainant, a woman's name, an address in the east side of Harlow, in the neighborhood near the municipal court annex, where lower-income residents typically interfaced with the system. Beside the name, under nature of complaint, someone had written, grabbed my arm, called me a name I won't repeat, took my ID, and wouldn't give it back for an hour. She filed this 3 years ago, Dara said. Yes. And nothing happened. Nothing happened, Takaz confirmed. She put the sheet back with its fellows. Dillard was the complaint intake officer for the security division for 5 years. He had access to every complaint that came in. He also had, apparently, a very effective system, making sure none of them went anywhere. Dara thought about the woman's name on the form, thought about all the names in those 17 boxes, thought about the number of times a person had to talk themselves into filing a complaint, had to decide that the cost of telling someone what happened to them was worth the vulnerability of putting it in writing, of attaching their name and address to a document, and handing it to the institution that had hurt them. And every one of those people had handed it directly to the man who hurt them. She pressed her mouth flat for a moment, breathed. What happens to those files now, she asked. They're federal evidence, Takaz said. Every complaint gets reopened. Every complainant gets contacted. Dara nodded once. That was the right answer. She'd expected it, but it still mattered to hear it said plainly. By noon, the courthouse main floor had been partially reopened. The lower level remained sealed, and the east corridor had been transformed into something that resembled an incident command center without anyone officially declaring it one. Takaz's team occupied 3 folding tables they'd sourced from a conference room upstairs. Equipment had come in from the federal vehicles, secure laptops, evidence bags, a portable document scanner. 2 additional agents had arrived from the regional field office. Dillard and Carver had been separated. Dillard was in a courthouse conference room on the 2nd floor with 1 agent outside the door. Carver was in a different room on the same floor. Neither had been formally charged yet. Neither had been told they could leave. Deputy Morse had been transported to Harlow Regional. His fibula was fractured. The laceration had required 8 stitches, and he would be off duty for 6 weeks. He had asked, before the paramedics loaded him, whether the nurse who'd helped him in the corridor was going to be okay. The paramedic had told him she appeared to be fine. Morse had said, good. She was calm as anything down there. Calm as I've ever seen anybody. Dara didn't hear that. She was in the east corridor, sitting on the bench where she'd treated Morse, working through a protein bar she'd found in the bottom of her medical bag, and making notes on a legal pad someone had found for her. Not emotional notes, clinical ones. A timeline of what she had observed, heard, and smelled from the moment she arrived at the courthouse entrance. Timestamps where she had them. Descriptions of physical positioning, body language, exact words. Her cheek ached. Not sharply a dull, spreading ache that she was aware of the way you're aware of a shoe that's slightly too tight. She had not asked for ice. She was annoyed that she hadn't asked for ice, not because it would have helped the ache significantly, but because declining it had been a reflex, the old reflex of not drawing attention to her own damage while there was still work to do, a reflex that was useful in the field and somewhat counterproductive in a building full of federal investigators who needed a clear evidentiary record. She made a note to have someone photograph the marks on her cheek before it faded. A young agent, she put him at late 20s, knew enough to still be slightly uncomfortable talking to the person who was simultaneously a witness, a victim, and, based on the way Takahas talked to her, someone with a history that put him well below her, in some hierarchy he wasn't fully tracking, set a cup of coffee on the bench beside her. Deputy Inspector General Takahas would like to start your formal interview when you're ready, he said. I know. Dara picked up the coffee. It was hot and black and not quite right, but it was coffee. Tell her 20 minutes. She said to tell you 15. Dara looked at him. 20 he went. She finished her notes. Finished the protein bar. Photographed the mark on her cheek with her phone, which one of the agents had returned to her along with her ID 2 hours ago, pointedly, in front of Dillard. Then she stood, squared her shoulders, and walked down the corridor toward the conference room where Takahas was waiting. The interview took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Dara gave it the same way. She gave everything methodically, without elaboration where elaboration wasn't needed, without softening anything that didn't require softening. She described the entrance encounter from the moment she stepped out of the parking structure. She described the physical contact, the words used, the exact sequence. She described the holding room, the smell of gas, the camera she had addressed directly. She described the evacuation, Morse's injuries, the detainees, the sequence in which she had moved each person. Takahas took her own notes. She did not interrupt except to clarify specifics. At one point she said, when Dillard made initial contact with you at the entrance, did you have any expectation that it might escalate the way it did? Dara considered that for a moment. She thought about being precise. I had an expectation that it might escalate, she said. Not specifically to physical contact. But I recognized the behavior pattern. He had already decided what I was before I showed him anything. That kind of certainty tends to produce escalation when it's not confirmed fast enough, and you declined to confirm it. I declined to leave, Dara said. That's different. Takahas made a note. Why didn't you press harder? You could have been more insistent about calling Clerk Adler. I was insistent. He wasn't interested in the call. She paused. And I knew the camera was running. I needed the encounter on record, not resolved off camera. Takahas looked up from her notes. You kept the engagement going deliberately, she said. Not an accusation, an understanding. I kept it accurate, Dara said. I said what was true. I asked for what was reasonable. I didn't escalate and I didn't retreat. What happened next was entirely his choice. There was a silence. Takahas held her pen above her notepad without writing anything. The mark on your cheek, Takahas said finally. That was not an anticipated cost. No, Dara said, it wasn't. Another silence. The kind where something real was being acknowledged, Takahas said, and moved on. At 3 in the afternoon, 2 things happened almost simultaneously that changed the shape of everything that had been building since morning. The first was that the forensic IT team Takahas had pulled in, finished their preliminary review of the security camera archive on the courthouse's main recording server. The system had been running continuously for 14 months, recording footage from 11 internal cameras and 3 exterior units. The footage had never been reviewed, never been requested, never been flagged. Dillard, as security chief of operations, had been the only person with administrative access to the system. What they found in the archive was not just the morning's incident. It was a pattern. 11 incidents over 14 months, spread across the footage from 4 cameras, most of them in the same hallway where Dara had been assaulted. In each one, the scenario had the same basic structure, a person, always someone presenting as a non-professional, always someone who arrived without a visible advocate attempting to access the courthouse, being stopped by Dillard or Carver or occasionally another officer named Pruitt who was currently on scheduled leave, and being subjected to a level of force, language, or detention that bore no relationship to any legitimate security protocol. In 4 of the 11 incidents, physical contact was visible. In 7, the detained individual was walked toward the lower level. In 3 cases, the individual being detained had subsequently filed a complaint. 2 of those complaints were in the archive boxes found in the basement room. The 3rd complaint, the IT agent told Takahas, had been filed with the state attorney's office 6 months ago. It had been forwarded to the courthouse for internal review. It had never generated a response. The person who had filed it, a man in his early 40s named Garrett Doyle, a community health worker who had come to the courthouse to file paperwork on behalf of a client, had been detained for 4 hours, accused of creating a disturbance, and released without charges. He had photographs of bruising on his forearms. He had filed the complaint twice. Both times, the response had been the same, Reviewed, unfounded, closed. Garrett Doyle's file was sitting in the basement archive room in box number 14. That was the first thing. The second thing was that Sergeant Dillard requested a lawyer. He had held out until 3:17, which was longer than Takaz had expected, and shorter than his behavior that morning might have suggested. The request itself was unremarkable. It was his right. It was the obvious move. It changed the immediate trajectory of the interview process in predictable ways. What made it significant was what he said before he made the request. Takaz heard it secondhand, from the agent who had been in the room with him. She pulled Dara aside in the east corridor and told her directly, because Dara had earned the right to hear things directly. Before he lawyered up, Takaz said, keeping her voice low without making it conspiratorial, he said something to Agent Farrow. He said, and I'm quoting, "She set this whole thing up. She wanted this to happen. You need to look at what she was actually there to do." Dara said nothing. "He's going to make the argument that you were provocative," Takaz said, "that you manufactured the escalation, that the investigation you came here to conduct is itself grounds for." "He can make that argument," Dara said. "I know. The camera shows what it shows." "Yes." Takaz looked at her steadily. "But his attorney is going to subpoena your arrangement with Judge Okafor, the scope of your involvement here, the nature of your prior service, insofar as they can get access to any of it." She paused. "It's going to become about you for a while before it becomes about him." Dara absorbed that. She had known it was possible. Knowing something is possible and having it confirmed are different experiences, and she let herself feel the difference for a moment before she filed it in the appropriate place. "My involvement with Judge Okafor is documented," she said, "fully. Every communication, every authorization. Judge Okafor was explicit about scope, and I operated inside it." "I know that too." Then his argument dies in discovery. "Yes," Takaz said, "it does." She held Dara's gaze. "I need you to understand that between now and then is going to be uncomfortable." Dara thought about the woman's name on the complaint form. "The address on the east side of Harlow." Grabbed my arm. Called me a name I won't repeat. "Okay," she said. Judge Sylvia Okafor arrived at the courthouse at 4:45, which was exactly when she had said she would arrive, not sooner, because arriving sooner would have suggested concern that the situation required her physical presence before it was properly documented, and not later, because later would have suggested the kind of distance that looked like political positioning. Okafor was precise about timing in the same way she was precise about everything else, not as a performance, but because imprecision created problems that precision prevented. She was 61 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the carriage of someone who had decided somewhere in her 40s that she would stop managing how she appeared to people who had already decided what she was. She had been a JAG officer, then a federal appellate attorney, then a state superior court judge, and she had operated in every one of those roles and institutions that had not been designed for someone like her and had required her to be twice as documented and half as wrong as everyone else in the room. She had recruited Dara Whitfield for this investigation because Dara was the best person available. That was the whole reason. She had not complicated it with other considerations, and she would not complicate it now. She came into the east corridor and found Dara sitting on the bench again, coffee cup replaced by a fresh one, legal pad filled on one side and started on the other. She sat beside her. "You look like you've had a day," Okafor said. "I have the cheek. Photographed and documented." Okafor looked at it. Her jaw moved slightly, a compression, not sentiment. Something harder than sentiment. "Dillard is claiming provocation," Takaz told me. "His attorney is Vance Leland. Leland is good. He's going to find every piece of your background that's accessible and use it to suggest you were running an entrapment operation." She paused. "He won't find the classified material, but he doesn't need to. He just needs to make the jury spend time on you instead of his client." "I know how Leland works," Dara said. "Yes, I imagine you do." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then she said 17 boxes. "Yes." "How many complaints do you think total?" Dara shook her head. "The IT team is scanning. It'll take time." She paused. "Enough. Enough that it's not going to be possible to describe this as isolated incidents or bad days." Okafor nodded slowly. "That's what we needed." "That's what we needed," Dara agreed. There was a pause between them that was comfortable, in the way that pauses between people who have thought through the same hard problems become comfortable. Not warm, exactly, but solid, like weight-bearing. "There's something else," Okafor said. She reached into the leather folio she carried and removed a single document, a printed email chain. She handed it to Dara without preamble. Dara read it. The chain was between a courthouse administrative email address and an address at the county sheriff's department. The subject line was a series of numbers, a case reference code. The content was two exchanges, terse and transactional, referencing a complaint about courthouse security that had been filed with the Sheriff's Department 9 months ago. The exchange ended with the Sheriff's Department email saying, "Per our arrangement, this has been forwarded to internal for disposition." The internal disposition email at the bottom of the chain was routed to K. Dillard, CHS Operations. Dara looked up from the paper. The Sheriff's Department was routing complaints back to him, she said. Someone in the Sheriff's Department, Okafor said carefully. We don't know yet how high that goes. Takaz is working on it. She took the document back. It means the protection wasn't just internal to this building. Someone external was covering for him. Dara sat with that for a moment. The scope of it spreading outward, the way a crack in pavement spreads. You follow one line and find it connects to another and another, until the pattern is larger than the original damage. Is that going to slow the investigation? She asked. No, Okafor said. If anything, it accelerates federal jurisdiction. The moment you have multi-agency coordination in a pattern of civil rights violations, it becomes a much larger matter than a courthouse sergeant with a complaint box fetish. She paused. I want you to be prepared for the fact that when this breaks publicly, and it will break publicly, the first thing people are going to want to know about is you, your presence here, your arrangement with my office.
I know.
And your past. Dara said nothing for a moment. Looked at the far wall, looked back. I was careful for a long time about what people knew, she said. I thought it kept things simpler. It probably did for a while. She picked up her coffee. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to be careful about it the same way anymore. Okafor looked at her. No, she said quietly. I don't think you are. From down the corridor came the sound of Takahaz's voice, clear and directive, giving instructions to someone about document custody chains. 2 more federal vehicles had arrived in the parking lot. Dara could see them through the corridor windows, the low winter light catching their dark paint. The courthouse was filling with investigators the same way. Water fills a cracked vessel, finding every channel, every gap, every hidden space. And somewhere in a conference room on the 2nd floor, Kenneth Dillard sat across from an attorney he'd called in a hurry, running through the story he was going to tell, a story in which the woman he'd slapped and shackled and locked in a basement holding room had somehow been the one who constructed the danger she was in. His phone, which had been collected into an evidence bag 2 hours ago, contained 47 text messages he did not know Takahaz's team had already accessed through an emergency warrant. The messages were not about courthouse security. They were a conversation between Dillard and a number registered to a burner phone exchanges going back 11 months, clinical and coded in the way that people communicate when they know what they're discussing doesn't survive scrutiny. 6 of the messages referenced specific individuals by case number. 3 referenced complaint dispositions. 2 referenced payments. 1 message sent 4 days ago said, "Need the Okafor thing handled before the new year. You know what to do." The agent who read it first had photographed it and walked directly to Takahaz without stopping to process what she'd read. Takahaz had read it twice, set it down, and spent approximately 5 seconds looking at nothing in particular. Then she had picked up her secure phone and made a call to the federal prosecutor's office that lasted 11 minutes. Dara didn't know about the messages yet. She was finishing her notes in the corridor when the courthouse's overhead lighting, restored to full power by the facilities crew 2 hours ago, flickered once, twice, and held. She looked up at the lights. Then her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't immediately recognize, not in her contacts, but with a Harlow area code. She opened it. "You should have left when he told you to. This isn't over." Dara read the message twice. Not because she needed to read it twice to understand it, but because she was running a quick, cold assessment of what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and what the correct next move was. It meant someone outside this building knew she was here, and knew her phone number. It meant Dillard's network extended beyond courthouse walls, which the Okafor email chain had already suggested. But suggestion and confirmation were different things, and this was closer to confirmation. It meant the message sender believed a threat would accomplish something, which meant they didn't know her well enough to know that it wouldn't. She stood, walked to Takahaz's table, and set the phone face up in front of her without a word. Takahaz read it. Her expression didn't change. She called one of her agents over, had the message photographed and the number logged, then handed the phone back. "You want a security detail?" She said no. That wasn't really a question. "Then the answer is still no," Dara said. "A detail draws attention. I don't want anyone knowing this rattled anything, did it?" Dara picked up her phone. "I want the number traced." already being done. Takaz looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that wasn't quite concern, but acknowledged that concern was a reasonable response to the situation, even if neither of them was going to voice it directly. Go home tonight. Get some sleep. Be back at 8. 7:30. 7:30, Takaz said, without arguing about it. Dara drove home through streets that had gone fully dark, the kind of midwinter dark that settled into Harlow before 5 o'clock, and didn't lift until well after 7 the next morning. She turned the heat all the way up. The ache in her cheek had deepened into something more specific and persistent, and she had finally admitted to herself on the courthouse steps that she should have taken the ice when it was offered. She checked her mirrors at every third intersection, not out of fear, out of the same operational habit that made her catalog entry points in unfamiliar rooms, the behavior that had long since stopped feeling like vigilance and had become simply the way she moved through the world. Nobody was following her. She got home, made food she didn't fully taste, sat at her kitchen table with her legal pad and a fresh pen, and spent an hour reconstructing the full thread of the day into something that could serve as a clear personal record, independent of the official interview transcript. Timestamps, direct quotes where she was confident in them, observations marked explicitly as observations rather than facts. The threatening text sat at the back of her mind, not loudly but persistently, like a sound you can't identify. She photographed every page of the legal pad before she went to sleep. She was back at the courthouse at 7:22. The building's exterior looked different in the morning. The federal vehicles were still in the parking lot, 2 more added overnight, and a small cluster of local news cameras had set up on the sidewalk outside the restricted perimeter. Someone had talked, not to the point of specifics, but enough for the local affiliates to know that something federal was happening at the county courthouse, and cameras tended to appear wherever that word floated. Takaz met her in the East Corridor, which had been reconfigured overnight into something that now functioned properly as a command space, more equipment, power strips running along the base of the walls, a dedicated evidence intake table with a log sheet, a white board mounted near the fire exit, with a timeline that started at 7:51 yesterday and already had 43 entries. Number traced, Dara said. Burner, perched at a convenience store on Route 9. Paid cash 3 weeks ago. Activated once. Takaz handed her a printed sheet. The purchase timestamp puts it 2 days after Judge Okafor filed the formal scope authorization for your involvement, which means whoever bought it knew about the investigation within 48 hours of that authorization being filed. Dara read the sheet, looked up. Authorization documents are filed where? County Clerk's Office. Sealed, but accessible to specific administrative personnel. Takaz paused. We're working on who had access to that filing. Is Okafor aware? She's been briefed. She's not concerned about herself. She paused again, differently this time. She's concerned about you. She doesn't need to be. I know, I told her that. She didn't find it fully reassuring. Takaz gestured toward the evidence table. We got the full scan count on the archive boxes overnight. 411 complaint forms total. 377 marked unfounded by Dillard's hand. The remaining 34 are partially processed, some forwarded to dead ends, some misfiled in other categories. Of the 411, our preliminary cross-reference shows that 62 of the complainants had subsequent interactions with this courthouse that produced adverse outcomes, additional detentions, cases that went sideways in ways that could have been influenced by internal record manipulation. One individual whose pending case was dismissed without explanation 2 weeks after his complaint was marked unfounded. The number sat in the air. 411. Dara thought about the woman's name on that first form again. The address. Called me a name I won't repeat. 411 people had done the hard thing, had put it in writing, had handed it over believing something would happen. When does the DA's office get brought in? She asked. They're already in. Federal prosecutor Annika Webb has been on the case since the emergency warrant last night. She's moving for a formal grand jury referral this week. Takaz looked at the whiteboard. This stops being a misconduct investigation today. As of this morning, we're looking at a federal civil rights conspiracy case. The word conspiracy was not dramatic when Takaz said it. It was clinical. It described a specific legal structure, multiple people, coordinated action, sustained over time, aimed at depriving individuals of federally protected rights. It was accurate and it was serious, and it carried mandatory minimum sentences that were not nothing. Who else are we looking at besides Dillard? Dara asked. Carver admitted last night, with his attorney present, that he was aware of the complaint archive room. He says he discovered it approximately 8 months ago and said nothing because Dillard told him it was administrative overflow old documents pending digitization. Takahasa's tone was flat. He may be telling the truth about what Dillard told him. He's not telling the truth about believing it. What does Carver want? Cooperation deal. Webb is considering it. His testimony about the archive room is useful but not essential given the physical evidence. What she actually wants is the sheriff's department connection. And Carver says he doesn't know who Dillard was in contact with at the sheriff's. Says he only knew there was an understanding that certain complaints wouldn't go anywhere. She let that sit for a moment. We pulled Dillard's county communication records. Outside of the burner phone traffic, there are 12 calls over 8 months between Dillard's official courthouse line and a number registered to Captain Ray Sutter, who is or was, as of yesterday, the administrative oversight captain at the Harlow County Sheriff's Department. Dara took that in, an administrative oversight captain, the person whose specific job was supposed to be monitoring for internal misconduct. Has Sutter been contacted? He was notified of the investigation at 6 a.m. today. Takahasa's expression sharpened slightly, which for her was the equivalent of another person's visible agitation. He submitted a retirement notice to the sheriff's department at 6:47. Dara let out a slow breath. He's not going to outrun it, she said. No, he's not. Takahasa picked up a folder from the evidence table and held it out. This is your formal briefing packet. Webb wants you available this afternoon for a prosecutorial debrief. I need you to read through the evidentiary summary. First, there are things in there that weren't in yesterday's interview that you should know before you sit across from her. Dara took the folder. Started for the bench at the east wall. Whitfield, Takahasa said. She stopped. Leland filed a motion this morning. Defense counsel for Dillard. Takahasa kept her voice even, informational. He's seeking immediate disclosure of all documentation related to your involvement in this investigation. He's characterizing your presence here yesterday as an agent provocateur operation. I know what he's characterizing it as. The motion also seeks your military service records, insofar as they're accessible. Takahasa met her gaze. He's going to make the argument that your background represents a pattern of operating in concealed capacities and that your behavior yesterday was consistent with deliberate entrapment. He can seek the classified material, Dara said. He won't get it. He won't get the classified material. He will get your nursing license records, your employment history at Harlow Regional, your arrangement with Judge Okafor, and any prior federal consultancy work that's on file. All of that is clean. I know it is. Webb knows it is. Takahasa paused. What she wants you to understand, what I want you to understand, is that Leland's motion is designed not to succeed but to create a narrative. He doesn't need the court to rule in his favor. He needs the local press to run the question. Dara stood with that. She understood it. She had understood it yesterday when Takahasa first told her about Leland, and she understood it more specifically now. It was a particular kind of legal maneuver that was not about law, it was about atmosphere, about introducing enough smoke around a victim that the jury arrived already coughing. I'll be ready for Webb at 2, she said, and went to read the briefing folder. The prosecutorial debrief was in a conference room on the 3rd floor. The same floor where the protected witness Dara had originally been called to assess was still in custody, his chest pain having resolved with medication, his testimony in an unrelated fraud case now significantly delayed by the day's events, but not the court coordinator had told Takahasa in jeopardy. Federal prosecutor Annika Webb was 44. With reading glasses she took off and put on at intervals that seemed related to her level of irritation, and the kind of organized intensity that expressed itself not as urgency, but as the systematic elimination of everything that wasn't directly useful. She had prosecuted 3 federal civil rights cases in the past 6 years. 2 convictions, 1 plea. She was not someone who used the word conspiracy carelessly. She walked Dara through the evidentiary timeline for 90 minutes. She was direct about what was strong and what needed work. The camera footage was strong. This is the most valuable piece of evidence in the case, and the fact that it's continuous, unedited, and was running on a system Dillard himself administered is going to be very difficult for Leland to challenge. The archive boxes were strong, pending individual complaint verification. The burner phone messages were strong for conspiracy, pending linguistic analysis and pattern matching. Sutter's phone records were strong once a warrant extension was approved, which Webb expected within 24 hours. What needed work was the chain connecting Dillard's actions in the courthouse to the broader coordination with Sutter and whoever else was in the network. We have the what, Webb said. We need the architecture. The jury has to understand not just that Dillard did bad things, but that this was organized, deliberate, sustained. That's the difference between a bad employee and a federal criminal conspiracy, and I need that distinction airtight. The complaint routing, Dara said. Yes. If complaints were coming into the sheriff's department and being routed back to Dillard, there has to be an administrative record of that routing. Even informal systems leave paperwork. Agreed. We're pulling the sheriff's intake logs now. It's going to take time. Sutter's retirement filing is itself a record, Dara said. The timing of it, 6:47 a.m., 1 hour and 47 minutes after official notification. That's a response. That's documented panic. She paused. If his attorney tries to frame it as coincidence, pull the timestamps side by side. Webb looked at her over her reading glasses. Are you available for trial prep if this goes to a jury? I'm a witness. I can't consult on strategy. You're currently an informal federal contractor via your arrangement with Judge Okafor. The precise boundaries of that arrangement are worth revisiting. Webb set her pen down. I'm not asking you to do anything improper. I'm asking if you're available. Dara held her gaze. I will, Webb said, and moved on. The afternoon had gone gray. The news cameras outside had multiplied 3 affiliates now, plus what looked like a print journalist with a recorder who had positioned himself as close to the restricted perimeter as the tape allowed. Takahas had issued a brief statement confirming that a federal investigation related to courthouse security was underway and that no further comment would be made while the investigation was active. The statement had, predictably, produced more questions. Dara left by the east exit, which faced the parking structure rather than the street, and walked to her car without encountering anyone from the press. She sat in the parking structure for a moment, with the engine off. The briefing folder was on her passenger seat. She'd read the full evidentiary summary once during the morning, once again while Webb was on a call, and the thing that stayed with her was not the scale of the complaint archive, or the phone records, or even the suppression of Garrett Doyle's second filing. It was a detail in the preliminary forensic accounting that one of Takahas's agents had flagged, and that Webb had addressed briefly, but that seemed, to Dara's mind, more significant than the time spent on it had suggested. 3 of Dillard's last 8 paychecks had been deposited in a county account in his name. The other 5 had been deposited in a different account, same bank, different account number that was registered to a holding LLC with no obvious operational activity, no website, no listed address. The LLC had been incorporated 18 months ago. Its registered agent was a name Dara didn't recognize. But the incorporation date was 11 days after a county budget meeting at which the Courthouse Security Division's oversight contract had been renewed without competitive bidding. She had flagged it to Webb during the debrief. Webb had said, "It's in the queue." Dara understood that everything was in a queue. She also understood that financial architecture in a civil rights conspiracy case tended to be where the real power lived not in the person who did the visible harm, but in the system that made it worth his while to do it, and protected him afterward. She was thinking about who benefited from a courthouse security division that could suppress 411 complaints over 6 years. Not Dillard, not in any meaningful sense. Dillard benefited from impunity. Impunity at that scale required infrastructure. She started the car. She drove back to Harlow Regional not as a patient, but because she had a shift that evening that she had not canceled and was not going to cancel, because the emergency department needed her, and because she was not the kind of person who let the rest of her life stop being her life because something else was happening in it. She changed into her work scrubs in the locker room, clipped her badge, and walked out onto the floor at 5:58. Her charge nurse, Theo Park, looked up from the board and then looked again, more carefully. "I heard something happened at the courthouse," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "What's on?" He held her gaze for a moment. He was 40, efficient, good in a crisis, and perceptive enough to know when Dara was communicating that a subject was closed. He looked at the board. Bay 4 chest pain. 62-year-old male. Came in 30 minutes ago. Troponin pending. Bay 7. Laceration. Drunk college kid? Low priority. Bay 9. Fever and altered mental status in an elderly woman, transferred from a group home. Bay 9 first, Dara said. Altered mental status can't wait for troponin. She was already moving. She worked until 2 in the morning. 4 hours of sleep. Back at the courthouse at 7:26. The thing that greeted her was not Takahas or a briefing update. It was Agent Farrow, the young agent, who had brought her coffee 2 days ago, standing at the east entrance with his jacket on despite the cold, and his face carrying the particular tight expression of someone who had been awake long, enough that suppressing it required active effort. We have a development, he said. The LLC, Dara said. He blinked. How is it the LLC? He held the door. Takaha's needs you upstairs. The third floor had been converted into a secondary command space overnight. Takaha's was at a long table with Webb, two agents Dara hadn't seen before, and a man in his late 50s in a suit that said federal rather than local, not the cut of it, the demeanor. He had the unhurried gravity of someone who had driven here from somewhere further away than the regional field office. Deputy Inspector General Kowalczyk, Takaha said by way of introduction. He's joining from the main office. Dig Kowalczyk. This is Dara Whitfield. Kowalczyk extended his hand. He had the grip of someone who'd shaken a lot of hands in a lot of serious rooms and had decided a long time ago to just make it even and firm and leave it at that. Ms. Whitfield, he said. I've read your brief. He said it without elaboration, but there was something in the way he said it, a slight leveling of register. The way you adjust toward someone you've realized occupies a different category than the one you initially placed them in. The development, Dara said. Takas turned a laptop toward her. The screen showed a document, financial records, account transfers, a column of transaction dates on the left and amounts on the right. The LLC registered to Dillard's secondary payroll account? We pulled the corporate records last night with the warrant extension. The registered agent is a man named Fletcher Orrin. Orrin is a private attorney with an office in downtown Harlow. He incorporates holding entities for clients as a standard part of his practice. His client, in this case, is not Kenneth Dillard. Dara looked at the records, then at Takahas. Who is it? The beneficial owner of the LLC, the actual person receiving the financial benefit of the arrangement, is County Commissioner Dale Rathmore. The name landed in the room with the particular weight of a name that means something to everyone in the space. Dara had heard it. Rathmore had been on the county commission for 11 years, had been re-elected 3 times, was the commissioner who oversaw the budget subcommittee that included courthouse operations, and whose signature was on the no-bid contract renewal that had kept the current security division in place without review. Rathmore was paying Dillard, Dara said. Not a question. We believe Rathmore was using the security division as a suppression mechanism, Webb said, from the end of the table. Courthouse complaints that were buried weren't just protecting Dillard. They were protecting a pattern of practices that affected specific case outcomes, cases that involved individuals whose legal situations were, in various ways, connected to Rathmore's financial interests. She paused. We're still mapping the specific connections, but the LLC payments correlate with periods of intensified complaint activity. It's not random. Dillard was being paid to run a system. Dara looked at the transfer records again. Looked at the dates. The burner phone message. Need the Okafor thing handled before the new year. That came from Rathmore's network? We believe so. The burner that sent you the threat is from the same purchase location and time frame as 2 other burners we've traced to activity in Rathmore's orbit. Kowalczyk said, we don't have direct proof yet that Rathmore personally sent it or ordered it. We will. You're moving on Rathmore, Dara said. This morning, Kowalczyk said. That's why I'm here. We're executing a warrant at his commission office and his home simultaneously within the hour. We're also issuing a material witness hold on Sutter. His retirement doesn't get him out of this building's jurisdiction. He looked at Dara steadily. I wanted you to hear this directly from this room, before it becomes public, because when Rathmore's name goes on record, yours will be attached to the investigation that surfaced it, and there will be a period of noise, Dara said. Yes, I can handle noise, I have no doubt, he said. And there was something in it that was not quite deference, more like acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone who had read a brief that contained information he was not permitted to discuss aloud and had adjusted accordingly. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the hum of equipment and the muffled sound of the news cameras somewhere below. Then Webb's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, read, and set it down without expression. Rathmore's attorney just filed an emergency motion to halt all federal activity at the commission building, she said. Filed 3 minutes ago, which means Rathmore knew we were coming. Kowalczyk was already on his feet. Execute now, he said into his own phone. Don't wait. Takaha's was moving. The 2 new agents were moving. The room went from still to operational in the span of 4 seconds, and Dara stood at the edge of the table, watching it move, thinking about 17 boxes in a basement room, about 411 complaint forms, about the woman on the east side of Harlow who had handed her name and address to the very man who had grabbed her arm and waited for something to happen, about Rathmore, who had sat in a county commission office for 11 years, who had signed contracts and attended budget meetings and shaken hands at civic dinners, while in the basement of the building he helped fund. A sergeant with a filing system and a rubber stamp had been quietly making sure that none of the people who tried to speak ended up being heard. Pharaoh appeared at her elbow. "Do you need anything?" he said. "Water? Something?" "Where is Dillard right now?" she said. "Federal holding. Transferred last night after the warrant extensions. And the cameras from this building, the archive footage, the full 14 months. Where is that stored now?" "Secure federal evidence server. Webb's office holds the access keys." He paused. "Why?" Dara didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about Leland's motion, the agent provocateur narrative he was building, the questions that he was planning to put in the air. She was thinking about the fact that the camera footage that would dismantle that narrative was the same footage that documented the assault on her face, the same footage that showed Dillard in frame, deliberate, and that connected backward through the archive to 11 prior incidents in the same hallway. She was thinking about the fact that a motion filed by Rathmore's attorney 3 minutes before a warrant execution meant someone in the federal process had communicated information that shouldn't have left the room. "Which personnel had access to the warrant schedule this morning?" she said. Pharaoh went very still. He stopped. "That's a good question." "Get Takaz," Dara said quietly, "right now." Pharaoh moved fast, which told Dara something about him that he understood the implication without needing it explained twice, which meant either good instincts or good training, and in either case he was useful right now. Takaz appeared in the doorway 40 seconds later. She had her phone in one hand and her expression had shifted from operational to something sharper, the particular alertness of someone who has just been handed a variable that rearranges the board. "Tell me," she said. "Rathmore's attorney filed 3 minutes before the warrant execution," Dara said. "That means someone in this process communicated the schedule. I need to know who had access." Takaz didn't argue the logic. She turned to Pharaoh. "Pull the warrant distribution list. Everyone who received the execution schedule, when they received it, and how it was transmitted." She looked back at Dara. "How confident are you?" "The motion was filed at 6:51. We finalized the execution window at 6:32 in this room, with 7 people present plus 2 on the phone." Dara kept her voice flat. "That's a 19-minute window between internal confirmation and an opposing attorney filing emergency paperwork. Even if Rathmore's attorney was already at his desk and ready to file, he had to receive the information first." 19 minutes isn't an accident, no, Takahas said. "It isn't. She was already typing on her phone. Kowalczyk needs to know. Is the warrant executing? His team is at both sites now. The motion doesn't halt anything. It's an emergency request, not an injunction. A judge has to rule on it, and Webb's office is already opposing." She finished typing, looked up. "The execution proceeds. But if someone inside leaked the schedule, whatever they were hoping to accomplish, a document shred, a communication purge, someone getting out ahead of it has had 19 minutes to happen. That was the cost." Dara understood it the same way she understood the cost of most things, not as a catastrophe, but as a variable to be accounted for. 19 minutes in an office with forewarning was enough to move things. It was not, if the warrant team was competent, enough to move everything. "Who was on the phone during the 6:30 briefing?" she asked. "2 agents from the regional office," Pharaoh said from behind his laptop. He was pulling the distribution log in real time. "And a paralegal from Webb's office, who was handling the warrant filing coordination." The 3 of them looked at each other. "Get Webb," Takaz said. It took 40 minutes to establish what had happened, and the answer when it came was not the one any of them had expected. The paralegal, a 29-year-old named Steph Galloway, 18 months out of law school, working her first federal assignment, had not leaked the schedule. What she had done was log the finalized execution window in the case management system at 6:39, which was standard procedure, which she had done correctly. The case management system had a security protocol that was supposed to restrict access to authorized personnel. The protocol had a vulnerability, not a sophisticated one. A configuration error in the system's permission hierarchy that had been present since the system was last updated, 14 months ago, that allowed any user with county-level court administrative credentials to view the restricted case log in read-only mode without triggering an access alert. The county court administrative credentials were held by 17 people. One of them was a courthouse records clerk named Marta Press, who had worked in the building for 9 years. Another was Ray Sutter, whose credentials had not yet been revoked because the formal separation paperwork from the sheriff's department was still processing. A third was an assistant in the county commissioner's office, whose name appeared on no list anyone had thought to pull. The assistant's name was Derek Van. He was 23 years old. He had been hired by Rathmore's office 14 months ago, the same month the case management system was last updated. His county credentials had been issued on his first day. Van had accessed the restricted case log at 6:35. He had spent 4 minutes in the system. He had logged out at 6:39. Rathmore's attorney had called his client at 6:43. The emergency motion was filed at 6:51. He installed a monitor, Webb said. She was at the head of the table in the third-floor command space, reading glasses on, the particular controlled fury of a prosecutor watching a case acquire complications that were nobody's fault and everyone's problem, or someone installed it for him. A passive access point that flagged new entries in the restricted log and notified Van's credentials when activity posted. She took her glasses off. This is obstruction. This is active interference with a federal investigation. It's also evidence, Dara said, from her chair at the side of the table. Webb looked at her. The access log showing Van's credentials in the restricted system at 6:35, Dara said. That's documented. The call from Rathmore's attorney to Rathmore at 6:43, you can pull that from the phone records. The chain is clean. You don't need to prove who built the monitor. You need to prove who used the information. We need Van, Webb said. Then pick him up now, before he knows the access log has been pulled. Webb looked at Takahas. Takahas was already on her phone. Derek Van was taken into federal custody at 9:17 a.m. at a coffee shop 4 blocks from the commission building, where he had apparently gone after leaving work. Early, the commission building's keycard log showed him exiting at 7:02, 19 minutes after Rathmore's attorney filed the motion. He was young enough that his face, when the 2 agents sat across from him in the coffee shop and showed him their credentials, went through fear and calculation and the dawning recognition of a position he could not negotiate his way out of in a single unbroken sequence that took about 6 seconds to complete. He did not ask for an attorney immediately. That was, from the federal perspective, useful. He talked for 45 minutes. Not about everything. He was smart enough to be strategic, and he understood that what he said in the next hour would define the shape of what came after. But he talked about the access monitor, which he described as something he'd been asked to set up, not something he'd designed himself. He talked about who had asked him, not Rathmore directly, which was apparently how Rathmore operated on anything that could produce criminal exposure, but a woman named Cecile Drummond, who was Rathmore's deputy chief of staff, and who had given Van the instruction as though it were a routine administrative task, which it had not been. But Van had been 23 and new, and had not asked questions he now understood he should have asked. When the agents asked him about the burner phone specifically, whether he knew anything about communications directed at individuals connected to the federal investigation, Van went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need an attorney." The attorney he requested arrived within the hour. By noon, a cooperation agreement was being drafted. Dara heard the summary from Takahas at 12:30, eating a sandwich at the East Corridor bench that had, over 3 days, become something like her unofficial workstation in this building. She ate mechanically, listening, and when Takahas finished, she said, "Drummond, was she at the 6:30 briefing?" No. But if Van was her instrument, and he had access to the case management system, she didn't need to be. Takahas paused. "We think Drummond is the operational layer between Rathmore and the suppression network. Rathmore makes no direct moves. Drummond translates his interests into actions. Dillard executes. Sutter covers the external route. Van monitors the pipeline. A clean firewall," Dara said. "Rathmore at the center. Nothing that touches him directly. Until now," Takahas said. Dara thought about that structure, the elegance of it, in the way that ugly things could be functional. Someone had designed it carefully. Not Dillard. Dillard was a blunt instrument, useful for what he was, incapable of the architecture. Not Sutter, who was a follower protecting a comfortable position. Drummond, possibly. Or someone advising Drummond, the LLC attorney, Dara said. Fletcher Oren. What do we know about him? Takahas pulled out her notepad. Clean record. Corporate practice. Incorporated 642 LLCs over 11 years. 15 of them are flagged as potentially dormant shell structures. He's not a target, he's a service provider. Is he a knowing service provider? Takahas was quiet for a moment. Webb is looking at it. If Oren understood what the LLC was being used for, he's not a bystander. Dara finished the sandwich, folded the wrapper. I'm not saying he did. I'm saying it's worth the question. Everything is worth the question right now. Takahas put the notepad away. The warrant team at Rathmore's commission office found 3 things of interest. First, a shredder that had been used recently, warm motor, fresh ribbon residue. Second, a personal laptop that was not in the office's declared inventory, which we believe was his private communication device and which our forensics team is working on now. Third, a locked drawer in his desk that contained a folder labeled with a case number that corresponds to a civil litigation matter from 4 years ago, a wrongful detention suit filed by a woman who had been held by courthouse security and later released without charges. Dara looked up. The suit was dismissed, Takaz said. The plaintiff withdrew her claim. The folder in Rathmore's drawer contains correspondence between his office and an attorney representing the plaintiff, and the correspondence discusses a settlement payment in an amount that was not disclosed in public court records. She paused. It also contains a letter, unsigned, advising the plaintiff's attorney that continued litigation would be, quote, inadvisable, given the information available to certain parties regarding your client's prior record. The room was very quiet. He threatened her into withdrawing, Dara said. We believe so. The plaintiff's name is Lorraine Sefcik. She's 41. She lives in the Whitmore district. She works as a home care aide. The detention she reported was consistent with the pattern documented in the archive boxes. Takahaz's voice remained even. We're going to contact her today. Dara absorbed that. Lorraine Sefcik had done everything right, had filed the suit, had retained counsel, had pushed through the difficulty and expense and vulnerability of taking it to the level of civil litigation. And someone from a county commissioner's office had reached down into that process and threatened her back into silence. The unsigned letter, Dara said. Can you source it? Forensics is working on the paper and the printer. The language in it has been submitted for stylometric analysis. It may take time, but it was in Rathmore's drawer. In Rathmore's locked drawer, Takahas confirmed, with a case number on the folder that matches Sefcik's suit. That's enough for Webb. It's enough for a great deal, Takahas said quietly. Dale Rathmore was taken into federal custody at 2:48 p.m. at his home in the Greenvale neighborhood on the north side of Harlow, after spending the hours between the warrant execution and his arrest in what his attorney would later describe as a period of consultation and cooperation, and what the warrant team's report would describe as a 3-hour window, during which the personal laptop had been connected to an external drive and then disconnected, a fact that Rathmore's forensics team had noted because the laptop's own activity log had not been wiped cleanly and retained a timestamp of the connection. The arrest happened quietly, which was Kowalczyk's preference. No press notification, no perp walk, 2 agents a vehicle, and a set of federal charges that were read clearly and completely in the entryway of a house that had a view of the Harlow River, from the back porch and artwork on the walls that had probably cost more than Dillard made in 3 years. The charges included conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of federal proceedings, witness intimidation, and misuse of public office for private financial benefit. Cecile Drummond was arrested at her apartment 40 minutes later on a parallel set of charges that included conspiracy, obstruction, and directing the unauthorized access of a federal case management system. Ray Sutter, whose retirement notice had not in the end provided any insulation from the reach of a federal material witness hold, was escorted from his home at noon and transported to a federal facility where, 3 hours later, he agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a recommendation of reduced sentencing. His cooperation produced 2 additional names, both within the sheriff's department, both in administrative roles, who had been involved in routing complaints back to Dillard over the previous 4 years. Both were suspended pending review before the end of business. The news broke at 4 p.m. Not because anyone in the federal operation released it, but because a courthouse employee who had watched 3 days of federal vehicles and camera teams and had finally recognized Rathmore's name on a document that crossed her desk sent a text to her cousin, who worked at a local news station, and by 4:15 all 3 television affiliates were running the story, and 2 national outlets had picked it up on the wire. Dara watched none of it. She was at Harlow Regional in Bay 4, managing a pediatric respiratory case that required her complete attention, and got it, because that was how she worked the thing in front of her, got everything she had, regardless of what was happening elsewhere. She heard about the arrests from Takahas at 7 p.m. in a call she took in the hospital corridor outside the break room. It's moving, Takahas said. I know. Webb wants you in at 9 tomorrow for a formal recorded statement. The prosecutorial phase is beginning. Your testimony is central to 3 of the charges against Dillard: the assault, unlawful detention, and civil rights violation counts. I'll be there. A pause. The press knows your name. I expected that. They're going to want to talk to you. I'm not going to talk to them. I know. I'm telling you they're going to try. Another pause. slightly different in quality. You handled this well, Whitfield. All of it. Dara leaned against the corridor wall. The hospital noise moved around her, the PA system, a cartwheel, someone's cough from 3 bays over. Normal sounds, her sounds in this context. Lorraine Safik, she said. Has someone contacted her? Agent Farrow made contact this afternoon. She's aware the investigation is underway. She's been told her complaint is being reopened and that her civil case may be revisited. A pause, she cried, when Farrow told her. He said she didn't say anything for a while, and then she said she thought nobody was ever going to look at it. Dara said nothing for a moment. Okay, she said, I'll be there at 9. The recorded statement took 4 hours. Dara had given testimony before in context she was not at liberty to describe, in rooms with security classifications that didn't appear on civilian paperwork, and she understood the discipline required to make an oral account both accurate and legally useful. She gave it the same way she gave everything, without embellishment, without performance, in a sequence that held together, because it was true, and because she had documented it contemporaneously, and because nothing she said in that room was going to be possible to characterize as convenient reconstruction. Leland was not in the room. He would receive the transcript. Whatever he intended to do with it, he would have to do with material that was clean. When she finished, Webb asked 2 follow-up questions. Then she looked at Dara across the table. Leland's agent provocateur motion was denied, she said. Ruled this morning. The judge found no evidentiary basis for the characterization. Dara nodded. He's going to appeal. Let him, Dara said. I intend to. Webb allowed herself something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. He's also filed a motion to suppress the camera footage on the grounds that the recording captured a lawfully detained individual without consent. I was unlawfully detained. That's the central charge. Yes, the motion is circular on its face. It won't survive. She paused. I wanted you to know it's being filed because the press will likely report it as though it's a serious development. I understand how press works. I know you do. Webb gathered her papers. We're going to need you available over the next several weeks. Not every day, but on relatively short notice. Is that workable with your schedule at the hospital? I'll make it work. Webb looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had learned to recognize something in other people who were doing the same. The people in those boxes, Webb said, the 411, some of them are going to be contacted, and some of them are going to be invited to participate in the civil remediation process, and some of them are not going to want to, because what happened to them happened a long time ago, and they've built a way of living around it, and that's their right. She paused. But there will be others, and those others are going to have a path, now, that they didn't have before. She picked up her briefcase. That came from you, Dara said. It came from all 411 of them filing complaints that Dillard thought he'd buried forever. Webb accepted that. It was, after all, true. The formal charges filed against Kenneth Dillard included federal civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, assault under color of law, unlawful tashin, conspiracy in the suppression of official complaints, and obstruction of justice. The charges filed against Dale Rathmore included the full conspiracy count, obstruction, witness intimidation, and misuse of public office. Drummond faced parallel charges. Sutter's cooperation produced a reduced filing with an agreement that remained under seal. Carver's cooperation deal was accepted. He received a suspended sentence conditional on full testimony, immediate termination from courthouse employment, and permanent prohibition from law enforcement work. Pruitt, the third officer, currently on leave, was reached by federal investigators the following morning and suspended pending a formal charging decision. His cooperation was offered and under review. It was not neat. Cases of this size were never neat. They were sprawling and slow and full of procedural motion and counter-motion and legal delays that were frustrating to the people who had to wait through them. Dara understood that. She had operated in enough institutional processes to know that the visible moment, the arrest, the charge, the warrant, was the dramatic surface of something that would grind on for months underneath. What mattered was that it had started. The machine was running. She was back at Harlow Regional for her overnight shift 2 days after the recorded statement when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she recognized, Judge Sylvia Okafor. Need to speak with you tomorrow. Not about the case. About something else. Are you free at 10? Dara read it twice. The phrasing was deliberate. Okafor didn't use imprecise language. Not about the case, about something else, which meant it was related to the case but not to the active prosecution. Something adjacent. She texted back, yes. Where? Okafor's reply came fast for someone who was normally measured with her communication. My office. And Whitfield come in the front door this time. Dara put her phone in her pocket and went back to her patient. She tried, for the rest of the shift, not to think about what Okafor's message meant. She was mostly successful, but the part of her mind that didn't switch off the part that cataloged and assessed and ran quiet calculations on incomplete information kept returning to one particular phrase. Something else. At 5:40 a.m., walking to her car in the hospital parking structure, she stopped at the sound of footsteps behind her. Turned. Nothing a facilities worker 3 levels up pushing a cart. No threat. Nothing. She was tired. She had been sleeping in fragments for days, and it was showing in the edges of her awareness, in the half-second delay between stimulus and assessment that she recognized as fatigue and that she did not like. She drove home, showered, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table with the legal pad she'd carried through the entire week, and opened to a clean page. At 8:50, she locked the front door, got in her car, and drove to the Harlow County Superior Court building, where Judge Okafor's office was located on the 4th floor. The clerk at the front desk looked up when she came in, checked her ID, picked up the desk phone. Judge Okafor? Ms. Whitfield is here. Yes, ma'am. He looked at Dara. She says, go right up. Dara took the elevator to the 4th floor. The corridor was quiet at this hour, dark wood paneling, framed documents on the walls, the specific hush of a building that operated on formality as a structural principle. Okafor's outer office was empty. Her assistant wasn't at the desk. The inner office door was slightly open, and Dara pushed it wider. Okafor was behind her desk. She was not alone. Seated across from her, in the chair that faced the desk, was a woman Dara had never seen in person. Late 50s, sharp-faced, with a federal badge clipped to her jacket that was a different agency than Takahas's, the particular shade of credential that indicated a division Dara recognized from a context she had not expected to encounter here. On the desk between them was a file folder. Dara could not see the cover from the doorway, but she could see that the folder's edge carried a colored classification stripe. Not courthouse records, not case management files. Federal. Classified. Okafor looked at her. Close the door, she said. Dara closed it. She stayed near it, because old habits were old habits, and because she had learned years ago that knowing where the door was mattered. This is Deputy Director Voss, Okafor said. Office of Civil Rights Enforcement, Federal Inspector General's Division. She paused. She's not here about the Rathmore case. Dara looked at Voss. Voss looked back at her with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had prepared what she was going to say, and was going to say it, regardless of what reaction it produced. Ms. Whitfield, Voss said. I'm here because of something that your involvement in the Harlow investigation surfaced indirectly. She placed her hand on the classified folder without opening it. We've been running a parallel review, completely separate from Takahasa's operation, for the past 8 months. It concerns a pattern of civil rights suppression in municipal court systems across 3 counties, of which Harlow is one. She paused. The architecture behind these systems is more organized than what you've uncovered here. What Dillard ran was local. What we're looking at is not. Dara said nothing. The Rathmore network is one node, Voss continued. We have evidence of similar structures, same financial method, similar complaint suppression mechanisms in 2 other counties. Different personnel, same design. She looked at Dara directly. We believe they were built by the same person. Not Rathmore. Someone Rathmore was connected to. Someone who understood institutional architecture well enough to design a suppression system that looked like administrative dysfunction from the outside. The room was very quiet. Why are you telling me this? Dara asked. Voss opened the folder. She turned it and slid it across the desk toward Dara. On the top page was a photograph. A man in his early 60s, gray-haired, professionally dressed, photographed at what appeared to be a public event, a ribbon cutting, a civic function of some kind. Beside him, partially cut off at the frame's edge, was a figure Dara couldn't fully see. What she could see was the name printed beneath the photograph. She read it. The name was not Rathmore. It was not anyone connected to the courthouse. It was a name she recognized from a different context, entirely from a world she had spent years putting behind her, from a file she had been told was closed, from the classified operation in the country she was not permitted to name, in which the decisions made under fire had produced a commendation that was itself buried under 3 layers of federal administrative code. Her face didn't change. She had been trained too well for her face to change. But her hand resting on the desk beside the folder went very still. The name on the photograph was Elliot Marsh. Dara knew that name the way she knew certain other things, not as information she had looked up or been briefed on, but as something burned into a specific layer of memory that didn't fade with time, because the circumstances under which it was formed had made forgetting impossible. Elliot Marsh had been a civilian contractor attached to a federal logistics and intelligence coordination program that had operated, for a period of approximately 4 years, in regions where U.S. Special Operations units conducted medical and humanitarian support missions that were not acknowledged publicly. He had held no military rank. He had held something more useful than rank access, budget authority, and the particular kind of institutional invisibility that came from being classified as administrative support. She had last seen his name in an after-action document that she had been required to read and sign and never discuss. The document described procurement irregularities. It described the routing of medical supply funds through contractor accounts that did not correspond to any legitimate logistics operation. It described a situation in which personnel in her unit had been placed at elevated risk because equipment that should have been present was not present, because the budget line that funded that equipment had been redirected somewhere it was not supposed to go. 2 people had died in that operation, not directly because of the supply failure, but in the cascading way that things failed in the field, one problem creating the condition for another, the absence of the right equipment at the right moment narrowing the margin that separated a survivable situation from one that wasn't. The after-action inquiry had gone nowhere. Marsh had left the program 6 months later with his record intact. The inquiry had been closed without findings. Dara had been told, by people with the authority to tell her such, that the matter was resolved. She had never believed it was resolved. She had chosen, for reasons that were partly practical and partly about self-preservation, and partly about the limits of what one person could sustain as an ongoing fight, to put it in the part of her mind where things went when she couldn't act on them and shouldn't dwell on them. She had become a nurse. She had built Harlow Regional. She had done good work in the way that was available to her. And now a woman she had never met was sitting in a judge's office and sliding a classified folder across a desk with Elliot Marsh's photograph on top, in a conversation that had begun, ostensibly, about courthouse security misconduct in a small Midwestern county. Dara lifted her eyes from the photograph to Voss. "How long have you been tracking him?" she said. Voss didn't seem surprised by the question. She had probably anticipated it, had probably prepared for the version of this conversation in which Dara recognized the name immediately and skipped past the explanatory phase. 8 years, she said, actively, with sufficient evidence to move, approximately 14 months. 14 months. The same window as the courthouse camera archive. The same window as Derek Van's county credentials. The same window as the LLC incorporation.
He built the network, Dara said.
He designed the template, Voss said carefully. The municipal court suppression model. Not just here. We have documented instances in 2 adjacent counties, and preliminary indicators in 4 more across the state. Each one is locally operated a Dillard equivalent, a Rathmore equivalent, a Sutter equivalent, but the architecture underneath them is consistent. Same financial structure, same complaint suppression methodology, same firewall design. She paused. The design is too consistent to be parallel development. Someone built it once and replicated it. What does he get out of it? Dara asked. Not because she couldn't imagine the answer, but because she wanted to hear how Voss framed it. Control over case outcomes at the municipal level, Voss said. Specifically civil cases. He has financial interests in several development and real estate projects across the region that have faced legal challenges from residents and community groups. When those challenges pass through municipal courts with compromised security and suppressed complaint records, the outcomes are predictably favorable to his interests. She closed the folder. He's not running a crime operation for the money alone. He's running it because it makes everything else he does easier. Okafor, who had been silent since Dara closed the door, said, "The reason I asked you here is because of your prior connection to Marsh. We need to understand the scope of what you know. Not for the current prosecution, that case stands on its own evidence. But for the broader investigation, your access to the after-action material and your direct experience of his operational methods is relevant." Dara looked at her, then at Voss, then at the closed folder on the desk. "The after-action document I signed," she said. "The inquiry into procurement irregularities during my final operational tour. Who has access to that file?" Voss said, "Our division obtained access 11 months ago through a court-ordered declassification review." "Then you already know what I know." "We know what the document says," Voss said. "We'd like to know what the document doesn't say." The room held that question for a moment. Outside, through the 4th-floor window, Harlow looked ordinary gray winter sky, The courthouse parking lot visible in the distance with its cluster of federal vehicles. The flag above the building, moving slightly in a wind Dara couldn't feel from here. She pulled out the chair across from Voss and sat down. "Then you'd better get comfortable," she said, "because this is going to take a while." She talked for 3 hours. Not just about Marsh, about the operational context, the specific mission parameters, the way the supply chain had been structured, the point at which she had first noticed the discrepancy between what the manifest said should be present and what was actually in the field kit. She was precise about what she had witnessed directly versus what she had inferred versus what she had been told by others. She distinguished between documented facts, contemporaneous notes she had made and retained, and recollections that were clear but unverifiable. At one point, Voss stopped her and said, "You kept notes." "Yes, personal notes, from an operation that was classified." "I kept notes that were within scope of what I was permitted to document for personal medical record purposes," Dara said. "My notes describe medical decisions, patient conditions, equipment availability, and procedural context. I did not note anything that fell outside my own direct operational lane." She paused. "I am meticulous about scope." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." The notes, which Dara had kept in a personal encrypted file for 7 years and had never shown to anyone, were relevant. Not dispositive on their own, they were one person's contemporaneous documentation, but in the context of a broader evidentiary structure that included financial records, declassified procurement documents, and the emerging pattern across 6 county court systems. They were another point on a line that was becoming impossible to dispute. Okafor drove her home at 2 in the afternoon, which Dara hadn't expected and didn't argue with because she was tired in a way that had accumulated over days and had finally reached the level where it was affecting her judgment about small things, like whether she should accept a ride or insist on driving herself. They rode mostly in silence. Okafor drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, the radio off. "You knew what was in that folder before Voss opened it," Okafor said, about halfway. "I recognized the name," Dara said. "You didn't react." "I know how to not react." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "The people who died," she said, "in the operation." Dara looked out the window. "Yes, you've been carrying that." "It's not a burden," Dara said after a moment. "It's a fact. I carry facts. Some of them are heavier than others." She paused. "What I didn't carry well was the idea that the inquiry went nowhere." That Marsh walked away. He didn't walk away, Okafor said. He took 14 months longer to catch than he should have. That's different. Dara considered that. It was a distinction that mattered, even if the 14 months felt, in this moment, like a long time to have believed something that wasn't fully true. "Does Takahas know about Marsh?" she asked. "She's being briefed today," Okafor said. "The Harlow case becomes part of the broader investigation. Her work here is the first domestic prosecution in the pattern. It gives Voss's case a foundation that's already built." She paused. "Your work here," Dara said nothing. "I recruited you because you were the right person," Okafor said. "I want to be clear that I didn't know about Marsh's connection to the broader network when I did. I selected this courthouse because the complaint pattern was the strongest, the evidence trail was the most accessible, and I needed someone who could move through this institution without triggering its defenses before we had documentation." She glanced sideways. "I didn't know you had a prior connection to the person at the center of all of it." "Neither did I," Dara said. "Not until this morning. Does it change anything for you?" Dara thought about that honestly. The woman she had been 7 years ago, in a country she couldn't name, making decisions under conditions that had cost 2 people their lives, and had produced a commendation that nobody outside a classified file ever read. That woman had believed the inquiry would produce justice, had filed her documentation, had said what she knew to the people who were supposed to act on it, had waited, and then had built a different life. Because waiting forever for justice that didn't come was a way of surrendering everything else to the waiting. "It means I've been doing this work for longer than I knew," she said. Okafor drove. "The city moved past the windows," she said. "That's one way to see it." The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That was the honest truth about the aftermath of large investigations. The dramatic moment was the arrest, the charge, the warrant. What came after was documentation and depositions and procedural filings and the grinding institutional work of building a case that would hold in court. Dara moved through it with the same method she applied to everything. One task at a time, documented carefully, completed fully. She gave 3 additional recorded statements, one for the Federal Civil Rights Division, one for the State Attorney General's office, which had opened a parallel review, and one for Voss's broader investigation into the multi-county network. She reviewed her personal notes with two federal attorneys who treated the material with a seriousness that she appreciated without sentimentalizing. She was deposed by Leland, which was unpleasant in the specific way that cross-examination by a skilled attorney was designed to be unpleasant, and she gave her answers in the same register. She gave everything flat, accurate, impervious to the techniques that were designed to produce emotional reactions that could then be characterized as instability. Leland tried 4 different angles. None of them found purchase. After 2 hours, he ended the deposition with the clipped efficiency of someone cutting his losses while they were still manageable. She went back to Harlow Regional after every deposition. She worked her shifts. She treated her patients with the same complete attention she had always given them, because the emergency department did not wait for her personal life to achieve resolution before producing people who needed help, and she was not the kind of person who made the people in front of her wait while she processed the things behind her. Theo Park noticed she was running on less sleep than usual and made a point of not saying anything about it, which was the most useful thing he could have done. The federal charges against Marsh were filed 9 weeks after the morning in Okafor's office. The charging document was 43 pages. It covered conspiracy to violate civil rights across 6 jurisdictions, financial fraud in the administration of federal contractor funds, which reopened at last, the procurement irregularity inquiry that had been closed without findings 7 years ago, obstruction of federal proceedings, and directing a coordinated campaign of witness and complainant intimidation across multiple court systems. The day the charges were filed was a Tuesday. Dara was working an afternoon shift. She read the press release on her phone during a break, standing in the hospital parking lot in the cold, and then she stood there for a little longer than she needed to before going back inside. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more complicated, the particular sensation of a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying redistributing itself, not lifting entirely, not disappearing, just settling into a different configuration that was easier to bear. Dillard's trial began 4 months after his arrest. He entered the courtroom with Leland beside him, and the particular rigidity of a man who had decided that his posture was the one thing he could still control. The camera footage ran for the jury for 47 minutes. It showed everything: the entrance, the demand for credentials, the physical contact, the slap captured from the corridor camera at an angle that left nothing ambiguous, the zip restraints, the march to the lower level, the holding room door closing. Then it showed the evacuation. 11 jurors watched the footage of Dara moving through smoke with an injured deputy on one arm and said nothing. The 12th, later in deliberations, would tell the jury foreperson that watching it was the moment she stopped having any questions about the case. Not because Dara had done something extraordinary, though she had, but because of the contrast. The same person that Dillard had treated as a non-entity, as a problem to be removed, as someone who did not belong, had been the only competent presence in his building when it actually needed one. Leland's defense rested on 3 arguments. The first, that Dara had been acting as an agent provocateur, had already been denied twice at the pretrial level and was presented by Leland with the efficiency of someone meeting a procedural obligation rather than making a genuine argument. The second was that the physical contact during the detention had been within the scope of lawful security procedures. The camera footage made this argument difficult to sustain for anyone watching it, and the jury was watching. The third was that Dara's military background represented a relevant context, that her training made her capable of manufacturing a situation that appeared worse than it was. Dara testified for 4 hours. She was not nervous. She was not performing. She was as she had always been, simply present, answering each question with the specific accuracy that was her natural register, neither softening anything nor reaching for effect. When Leland cross-examined her and suggested that a person with her tactical training would have recognized multiple opportunities to diffuse the situation before it escalated, she looked at him calmly and said, "I told him to make a phone call. He chose not to. I'm not responsible for the choices he made." Leland tried 3 follow-up questions. None of them improved his position. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. They found Dillard guilty on all counts. He was sentenced 6 weeks later to 8 years in federal prison, with a recommendation against early release, given the sustained nature of the conspiracy and the number of documented victims. The sentencing judge, not Okafor, who had recused herself from all proceedings related to the investigation she had authorized, read the sentence in a tone that was judicial without being cold, specific without being performative. She noted the 411 complaints. She named Garrett Doyle and Lorraine Sefcik, specifically as individuals whose attempts to seek redress had been systematically blocked. She described what Dillard had done not as a series of bad decisions but as a sustained choice, made repeatedly over years to use institutional authority to silence people who had been harmed and had tried to speak. Carver received a suspended sentence with 5 years probation, permanent prohibition from law enforcement, and a requirement to provide testimony in all related proceedings. He had complied fully. His testimony had been useful in establishing the timeline of the complaint archives operation. He was 27 years old. Dara did not know what his life would become from here, but the prohibition was right and the cooperation had helped, and she was willing to let those two things coexist without resolving them into something neater. Pruitt was charged separately and entered a guilty plea on reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. He received 2 years, suspended with full cooperation requirements. Rathmore's trial was longer. His attorney was better than Leland, and the financial architecture of the case required the jury to follow a more complex evidentiary chain. But the chain was there, and Webb had built it carefully, and Voss's broader investigation had produced corroborating evidence from the 2 adjacent counties that made the isolated incident defense structurally impossible. Rathmore was convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of federal proceedings, witness intimidation, and misuse of public office. He was sentenced to 12 years. He was 58 years old. He would be 70 when he was eligible for release, if he was released at the minimum. Drummond received 7 years. Sutter, in exchange for full cooperation, received a suspended sentence, permanent prohibition from law enforcement, and a civil penalty that represented the estimated value of the corrupt compensation he had received. He paid it. Whether he slept well afterward was his own business. The LLC was dissolved. Fletcher Orrin, whose role as registered agent had been determined to be unknowing, cooperated fully and was not charged. Derek Van, who had been 23 and frightened and had accessed a federal database because a woman with institutional authority over him had told him to, received deferred prosecution in exchange for full testimony against Drummond. He was required to perform 600 hours of community service and was prohibited from holding any government position for 5 years. Dara thought this was probably right, though she wasn't certain, and she was comfortable not being certain. Elliot Marsh was tried in federal court 8 months after his indictment, in proceedings that drew national press attention because the scope of the network 6-county court systems, 14 years of documented operation, financial fraud connected to a classified federal contracting program was genuinely unusual. His attorneys were expensive and capable. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days, guilty, 16 counts. He was sentenced to 19 years. The procurement fraud conviction, which had been the hardest count to build given the age of the underlying conduct and the classified nature of the original inquiry, carried a mandatory minimum that the sentencing judge declined to reduce, citing the deaths that the supply failure had contributed to and the 7 years during which Marsh had operated freely, after an investigation that should have constrained him. The 2 people who had died were named in the sentencing statement. It was the first time their deaths had appeared in any public document in connection with Marsh's actions. Dara read the sentencing statement in her car in the hospital parking lot and sat with it for a while. She did not cry. She had not cried about them in years, not because she didn't carry them, but because she had found that the way she carried them was not in tears, but in the specific quality of attention she brought to every patient in every bay, the understanding, bone deep, of what it cost when the margin collapsed, and the right thing wasn't there at the right moment. She carried them in how carefully she worked. That had not changed. The courthouse reopened fully 3 months after the investigation began, under a new security contract administered by an independent oversight board that had been established by the county and required by a consent decree negotiated with the Federal Civil Rights Division. The board's mandate included quarterly complaint reviews, mandatory external auditing of all security incident reports, and a public dashboard that posted complaint filing and resolution data in real time. The archive box's all 411 complaint forms had been digitized and entered into the Federal Civil Rights Remediation Database. Each complainant had been contacted. The process of reaching them had taken months and was still ongoing for those whose contact information had changed or who had moved away. Of those reached, roughly 2/3 had agreed to participate in the remediation process. Some wanted acknowledgement. Some wanted documentation of what had happened corrected in official records. Some wanted nothing more than confirmation that someone had read what they wrote and that it had mattered. Garrett Doyle had been contacted in the first week. He was 42 now, still working as a community health worker, still navigating the same municipal systems on behalf of clients who needed help with paperwork that the system made harder than it should have been. When the federal agent told him his complaint was being reopened and that Dillard had been charged, Doyle had asked 2 questions. The first was whether his client, the one he had come to the courthouse for that day 4 years ago, had ever gotten the paperwork filed. The agent hadn't known. Doyle had said he'd figure it out himself. The second question was whether there was anything he could do to help the case. There was. He testified at Dillard's sentencing hearing. He spoke for 7 minutes, clearly, without notes, about what had happened and what it had cost him to believe that reporting it was worth anything. He said that for a long time after the complaint went nowhere, he had not filed any further complaints on behalf of his clients, because he had concluded that the system didn't work that way, and that this conclusion had cost some of his clients things they should have been able to access. He said he was revising that conclusion. Lorraine Sefcik's civil case was reopened. The wrongful detention claim she had withdrawn under pressure was reinstated, and the correspondence found in Rathmore's drawer, which forensic analysis had connected to a printer registered to Drummond's office, and which stylometric analysis had confirmed shared authorship with other documents produced by Drummond, was entered as evidence of improper interference with her civil proceedings. The case settled on terms Sefcik found acceptable. She did not discuss the terms publicly, and that was her right. What she did discuss, in a brief statement she released through her attorney, was this: that she had known something was wrong, had tried to say so, had been made to feel that saying so was dangerous, and had spent years doubting whether she had been right to say anything. The answer, it turned out, was that she had been right, that she had always been right, and that the system had been wrong, not her. Dara read the statement on her lunch break. She read it twice. 6 months after the courthouse incident, Dara received a letter from the Federal Inspector General's office. It was formal in language and specific in content, and it informed her that her service record, the full record, not the redacted civilian version, had been formally reviewed, and that certain commendations and citations that had been classified at a level prohibiting public acknowledgement were being declassified and added to her accessible federal service file. The letter listed them. There were 4. The one she had known about the commendation for the operation she couldn't name was the last on the list. Above it were 3 others from earlier in her service that she hadn't thought about in years. Small things by the standards of people who collected such things, meaningful by the standards of a record that was supposed to represent accurately who she was and what she had done. She put the letter in a folder in her filing cabinet. She didn't frame it. She didn't mention it to anyone at Harlow Regional, where she continued to work the overnight shift 4 nights a week. What she did do 2 weeks after receiving it was accept a meeting with Voss. The meeting was not at the courthouse or Okafor's office. It was at a federal building downtown, a neutral space, a conference room with a window that looked at a parking structure. Voss was there with one other person, a man in his 50s from a division Dara hadn't worked with before, whose title was Senior Advisor for Municipal Civil Rights Infrastructure. The conversation they had lasted 2 hours. It was not about the Harlow case. It was about what came after, about the 6 other county court systems still under review, about the methodology Voss's division was developing for identifying suppression patterns before they reached the scale of what had happened in Harlow, about the need for people who understood both institutional process and the particular texture of what it felt like to be inside, a building whose defenses had been deliberately turned against the people it was supposed to serve. What they were asking, without quite saying it directly, was whether she would be willing to work with them, not as a replacement for nursing, as a parallel capacity consultation on civil rights investigations where her combination of skills was relevant. She asked specific questions about scope, authority, compensation structure, and the reporting chain. She asked about the nature of her role and what she would and would not be required to do. She asked about the cases that were already in progress and what involvement would look like in the near term. She took a week to think about it. Then she said yes. The last time Dara Whitfield walked into the Harlow County Courthouse as a visitor rather than as a staff member or witness or federal consultant, it was on a morning in late spring, 8 months after the morning she had first walked in with a medical bag and been stopped at the entrance by a man who had decided in the 2 seconds it took to look at her what she was. She was there to file a document for a client of Garrett Doyle's, a small procedural matter, form that needed a court stamp. The ordinary bureaucratic errand that was supposed to be simple and had, in this building, not been simple for years for people who looked like the people she was filing on behalf of. The new security team was professional. The officer at the desk asked for her ID, verified it, returned it with courtesy, and directed her to the clerk's office on the second floor. The process took 4 minutes. Nobody touched her. Nobody questioned what she was there to do. She got the stamp, came back down, paused in the main hallway for a moment. The marble was the same. The light was the same, the particular institutional light of a building designed to convey authority, which it did without any help from the people who moved through it. But the hallway felt different in a way that she could recognize, but not fully articulate. Not warmer, exactly. Not softer. Different in the way that a room feels different when the thing that was wrong about it has been removed, not a positive transformation, but the absence of something that shouldn't have been there. On the wall near the clerk's office, someone had installed a small framed notice. She hadn't seen it before. She stopped to read it. It was a statement of rights for courthouse visitors: the right to file a complaint, the right to be treated with dignity, the right to have any complaint reviewed by an independent body outside the courthouse security division. At the bottom, in smaller text, it noted that the Oversight Board had been established as a result of a federal civil rights investigation concluded in the prior year, and that the documentation that had supported that investigation included 411 complaints that had been suppressed over a period of 6 years. 411. Not a statistic, not a policy number. 411 people who had taken the hard step of putting what happened to them in writing and handing it to a building that had, for a long time, made sure it never went anywhere, and whose names now sat in a federal remediation database, with case files attached, with people assigned to them. Dara stood in the hallway and looked at the notice for a moment. Then she folded the stamped document into her bag, walked to the exit, and pushed through the door into the spring morning. The sun was higher than she expected. She had lost track of time inside. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, the same steps where she had carried a deputy and 2 detainees out of smoke 8 months ago, and let the light land on her face. She had a shift at Harlow Regional that evening. She had a call with Voss's office tomorrow morning about a case in a county 2 hours south. She had at some point in the next week to clean out the back seat of her car, which had accumulated the kind of debris that accumulates in the vehicles of people who live between one obligation and the next, and never quite managed to make the detour to the car wash. None of these things were extraordinary. That was fine. She had learned, in the particular way that people who have operated in extraordinary circumstances eventually learn, that the ordinary life running alongside the work was not the compromise version of something better. It was the whole point. The shift at the hospital was not the small thing, and the federal investigation the large thing. They were the same size. They were both just her, doing what she was capable of for the people in front of her on a given day. She walked down the steps. She had been slapped in this building, restrained, accused of things she had not done, locked in a basement room and left there, while someone assumed that the person he saw when he looked at her was the only person there was to see. She had been threatened. She had had her name put into a legal motion designed to make her look like the problem. She had sat in rooms where people were trying to determine whether what happened to her was her fault. None of that had been easy. She was not going to claim that it had been, because she was not the kind of person who reframed cost as a lesson without first acknowledging that it was cost. It had hurt. The mark on her cheek had taken 3 weeks to fully fade, and there had been days when she touched it unconsciously, not with self-pity, but with the particular awareness of a woman who understood exactly what it meant for someone to put that mark on her face, and what it said about what he thought she was. But she had not collapsed under it. She had not retreated from it. She had remained in the corridor, in the holding room, in the federal interview, in the deposition, in the courtroom exactly herself. Not a smaller version of herself, not a more acceptable version. The complete version, with the military record and the nursing badge, and the 7 years of silence about a classified operation, and the personal notes in an encrypted file, and the history she hadn't asked for, and the skills she had built anyway. The woman that Dillard had looked at and decided to dismiss had turned out to be the person who documented his entire operation, led the evacuation of his building, and sat at the center of the investigation that dismantled the network he served. She had not done it because she was extraordinary. She had done it because she was prepared, and because she had refused to be less than what she was in a room that wanted her to be nothing. The morning was cold and bright, and the city was moving around her in its ordinary way: cars, pedestrians, a delivery truck idling at the corner, someone's dog on a leash pulling toward a patch of grass. All of it indifferent to the courthouse behind her and what had happened in it. Indifferent in the way that the world was always indifferent to the specific battles fought inside specific buildings by specific people who had decided that enough was enough. The indifference didn't bother her. She had never done this work for the world's attention. She had done it because the alternative, knowing what she knew, having what she had, and walking away from a building full of buried complaints and a sergeant with a rubber stamp, was not something she could live inside comfortably. She was not built for comfortable inaction. She had been built by circumstance and choice in roughly equal measure, for exactly this, the difficult thing, done carefully until it was done. She reached her car, unlocked it, put the stamped document on the passenger seat. Her phone buzzed. A text from Theo Park: "You're not scheduled tonight. I put you on the board by accident. You're off." She stared at it. She had not had an unscheduled evening in 6 weeks. She sat in the car for a moment, thinking about what a person did with an unscheduled evening after the kind of 8 months she had just come through. She thought about her apartment. She thought about the book she had been reading in 10-page increments since November. She thought about the fact that she genuinely could not remember the last time she had made food she actually wanted to eat, rather than food she was eating because she needed calories before a shift. She texted Theo back, "Thank you." Then she sat a moment longer in the parking lot of the Harlow County Courthouse, in the ordinary brightness of a spring morning, with nothing she was required to do and nowhere she was required to be, and let herself feel the full, complicated, unresolved weight of everything that had happened and everything she had done and everything it had cost, without trying to make it smaller or neater or more instructive than it actually was. It was a lot. It was heavy and imperfect, and some of it she would carry forever, and some of it had already begun to take on the particular quality of old weight that had been set down rather than dropped, still real, still hers, but no longer something she had to brace against constantly. She started the car. She drove out of the parking lot and turned toward the part of the city where she lived, in the unremarkable direction of an ordinary afternoon. Behind her, the courthouse sat in the spring light with its new security team and its oversight board and its framed notice on the wall near the clerk's office, and the 411 names in a federal database somewhere that had stopped being buried and started being known. That was not nothing. In fact, of all the things she had done in her life, in the field, in the emergency department, in the hallways of a building, designed to make people feel small, it was among the most significant. Not because anyone would build a monument to it. Not because the people whose names were in that database would ever know hers. But because power, real power, did not always arrive with a title or a uniform, or a voice raised loud enough to fill a room. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in scrubs, carrying a medical bag, walking through a door it had every right to walk through, and simply refusing in the face of everything that was thrown against it to become anything less than exactly what it was.